Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington office of the Hoover Institution. I'm Jeff Marshner, Director of Media Relations here at Hoover and oversee the DC team. Today is particularly special as we join forces with our colleagues from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, also known as HI, to launch the prestigious 2024 AI Index report here in the heart of the nation's capital. The Hoover Institution has recently embarked on an exciting joint venture with the Stanford School of Engineering through the Stanford Emerging Tech Review. This partnership underscores our commitment to being at the forefront of research and education in technology and public policy. Collaborations with Stanford High enrich this mission, allowing us to provide critical insights that help inform the policymaking community on the powerful society-changing technology that is artificial intelligence. The AI Index, which we are proud to present today, stands as the preeminent annual report that measures the state of AI. This report is comprehensive, covering everything from technical performance and advancements in AI to policy trends and shifts in public opinion. Its findings are essential for anyone involved in the development, regulation, or use of AI technologies, providing a clear snapshot of where we are and where we are heading. Both Hoover and High are excited to share with you some of the key takeaways from the 2024 AI Index. We'll start with a brief presentation from some key findings.
At Google. All right, third time's the charm, hopefully, with the mic. We also collaborate with a bunch of data vendors that give us some really excellent data that we feature in the report, vendors like CSED, Epoch, and LinkedIn. And we do collect a lot of data ourselves, but we work closely with these partners. And the report has been pretty widely cited in newspapers across the world, as well as government reports across the world. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit for today's presentation and highlights the kind of wide reach of the report and the work that we do. All right, enough of the introduction. Let's actually dive into the takeaways that hopefully put you guys in an interesting position to understand what's going on in the space of AI. So the first big takeaway is on a high level that AI is beating humans on some tasks, but not on all. But before I actually dive into some of the benchmarks, I think sometimes with AI, it's actually very informative to look on a qualitative level on how much this technology has progressed. So one of the things that we did at the index this year is we went to Midjourney, which is a leading text-to-image model, and we asked Midjourney to generate a hyper-realistic image of Harry Potter, and we asked that same prompt to Midjourney V1 all the way to V6. Now, you can kind of see this progression over time, but I think this kind of illustrates it really well. The V1 Midjourney model was launched in February of 2022, and their generation of a hyper-realistic Harry Potter is almost cartoonish. I mean, it's impressive in a way in terms of how abstract it actually is. But then if you look to the right, the version that was released just last December is incredibly hyper-realistic. You almost have to kind of squint and look closely to notice that this is not Daniel Radcliffe. Now, if you look at it more from a technical perspective, there's a lot of benchmarks on which AI is already exceeding human performance. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, benchmarks are tests in the AI ecosystem that measure how well AI systems can do on various kinds of tasks. So one of the canonical benchmarks, for example, is ImageNet, which was created by the director of HI, Fei-Fei Li, and ImageNet is testing how well AI systems can classify images. On a lot of these benchmarks, AI has already exceeded human baselines. So for things like image classification, visual reasoning, English language understanding, and there's really only a few benchmarks left where AI performance hasn't exceeded some kind of human baseline standard, one of them being, for example, competition-level mathematics, which is on the far right. Another super important thing to notice here is you'll see that the slopes of these lines are getting progressively sharper the further out you go in terms of time, which is a signal that AI performance on a lot of these benchmarks is getting a lot better, a lot more quickly than it has before. When ImageNet was launched, it served the AI community for several years. I mean, this was a benchmark that researchers would use for a fairly long time. Whereas if you look at the far right, that's the benchmark for competition-level mathematics. The first AI systems that were tested on this benchmark did very poorly, and within a couple of years, performance has massively skyrocketed. Where is a lot of this research coming from? Well, data in the index suggests that it's mostly coming from industry actors and industry sources. This chart comes to us from Epoch, and it's looking at the number of notable machine learning systems that have been released by sector. You'll notice that since 2014, the majority of these systems come from academic institutions, and since then, a massive gap has emerged, up to the point where in 2023, there were 51 systems that came from industry compared to just 51 that came from academia. And when you look at the data from the perspective of as well of foundation models, which are, again, these large AI systems trained on massive amounts of data, you see a pretty similar breakthrough. Pretty similar breakdown. Industry is leading much further ahead of academia. And again, the organizations that are really leading the charge here, predictably, are those like Google, OpenAI, Meta, and Microsoft. Now, there's kind of an important question to ask. Why is it the case that industry is really positioning itself to be leading the charge here? I mean, there's a lot of different stories, a lot of different narratives to unpack, but critically, one of the most important stories is that it's just becoming substantially more expensive to train some of these models. We did some really interesting research work at the index this year, again in partnership with Epoch, where we tried to estimate how much compute it costs to train some of these foundation models. And you'll notice the real kind of incredible and jaw-dropping jump. In 2017, the transformer model, who here, by the way, knows what the transformer model is or has heard of this model? So we have some hands that have gone up in the room. So the transformer model is the architecture that underpins most, if not close to all, modern large language models and foundation models. So it's this kind of style of developing a system that has become really prevalent and really prominent. And we estimate that in 2017, it cost around $1,000 to train that original model in terms of compute rental prices. You fast forward all the way to 2023, and our estimates suggest that Google's Gemini Ultra costs close to $200 million. So, of course, there's really only a few actors in the world that can afford to bear that kind of computational cost. Now, why are these models getting a lot more expensive? Is OpenAI just kind of paying its research team a lot more? We looked mostly at compute costs, and if you actually map the compute costs of these models to the computation that they use to their actual cost, you'll notice that it's a pretty linear relationship. As you scale up compute, as you train these models on more data, which requires more computational resources, these models then become substantially more expensive. Where are these models coming from? Again, it's really the case that geopolitically, the United States is leading a lot of other nations in terms of the productions of models. So again, if you look at notable machine learning models, there were substantially more models of this type that were produced in the United States than, say, China and other nations. A fifth highlight that we have from the index that really kind of speaks to some trends in the world of responsible AI, which I think are going to be increasingly salient and increasingly important as time goes on, and as these tools become increasingly integrated into industry, is a question of, can we standardize their evaluations? So typically when a lot of these large language models or foundation models become released, they are tested on different benchmarks. So for example, when GPT-4 was launched, OpenAI will publish a technical report and will test these models on different benchmarks or different tests of how well AI systems do. And what you're seeing in this chart is a selection of pretty prominent AI developers and which general capabilities benchmarks they are testing their systems on. And you'll notice that when it comes to general capabilities, there are a couple of benchmarks on which there seems to be a consensus. So everybody seems to be testing on MMLU, which is a benchmark for general language understanding. All of these developers seem to be testing on Codex, which is a benchmark for coding competency. And all of them are testing on GSM-8K, which is a benchmark for mathematical competency. But when you actually look at the world of responsible AI benchmarks that try to test how responsible these models are, there really is no standardization. Some of the developers test on truthful QA, which is a benchmark for truthfulness and factuality. Others are testing on different toxicity benchmarks, and some are also testing on bias benchmarks like BOLD and BBQ. Now, I think the point the index is trying to make here isn't that responsible AI benchmarking is lacking, rather that there is a lack of standardized reporting. So these companies are testing themselves on different benchmarks, and it's not necessarily clear if this difference in testing reflects a genuine belief among the companies that one benchmark is perhaps better than the next, or if it perhaps is an attempt for companies to maybe cherry pick certain benchmarks that portray their models in better ways. But I think the ultimate takeaway here is that if we want to be in a world where we can do standardized and robust comparisons of the responsibility features of some of these large language models, we really need to standardize the way in which they are potentially compared. The sixth highlight from the world of economics is that generative AI investment has really skyrocketed in the last year. In 2022, you had around $3 billion of private investment in generative AI. In 2023, that number shot through the roof and went all the way to $25 billion. Interestingly, total investment in AI slightly decreased in the last year, I think mirroring a broader pattern where VC investments have gone down, but it really seems like venture capitalists are still deeply excited by private investment in generative AI. A seventh takeaway that we've had, which I think is very critical and I think is going to be one that is no doubt talked about in great detail on the panel today, is that there's now new data from a variety of different industries and a variety of different studies that shows that AI is associated with more productive work and also higher quality work. So what you're seeing in this slide is a cross-study comparison of task completion speed of a group of individuals that were doing different tasks, one of whom was given Copilot, so either GitHub's Copilot coding tool or Microsoft's Copilot productivity tool, versus those that didn't have access to any AI tools. And the 100% represents the kind of baseline. And what this chart is showing you is that across these different studies, the task completion speeds relative to the baseline were anywhere from 73 to perhaps in the 20% range. And that kind of really shows that AI is being increasingly associated with workers who are able to get work done a little bit more quickly. There was another study that came out of the world of consulting in which one group of people were given GPT-4 and another group of consultants was not given GPT-4. And those that used GPT-4 were more productive, they got work done a lot quicker, and they also produced work that was of substantially greater quality. Now, before I move on to the next highlight, I will say that it is important to caveat this. One of the interesting findings that we profiled in the index was another study where there were 3 different groups of participants, one of whom didn't get AI, one of whom got AI that they were told was good, but sometimes was prone to making mistakes, and a third group that got AI that they were assured was very, very good. Now, the groups that got AI did a lot better than the groups that didn't, but among the 2 AI receiving groups, the group that was told that their AI was good and always reliable actually ended up doing a lot worse than the group that was told that they got AI that was good, but sometimes made mistakes. And the authors theorized that what's really going on here is people, when they were told that they got very good AI, kind of fell asleep at the wheel. So it kind of points to the fact that there is still a need to keep humans in the loop in a lot of these processes. Scientific progress is also tremendously accelerating as a result of AI. There are so many different scientific developments that we profiled in this year's index, from GraphCast to Eevescape. I'll kind of highlight a few that I think are very significant. AlphaDev is a new computer program that came out of DeepMind that basically creates ways for algorithms to be substantially more efficient. And AlphaDev was integrated into the C++ library, which represented one of the first moments, I think, in the last decade when this library had been substantially updated in this kind of way. Similarly, if you look at some new discoveries out of the materials world, there was an AI project called GNOME that came out of DeepMind. And GNOME, what it really did was it used AI to discover new material structures. And that could be very valuable for synthesizing new chemicals, perhaps aiding in the making of semiconductors. And what you're seeing on these charts is the amount of materials that were discovered by the Material Project compared to GNOME. So GNOME is the kind of AI method. Material Project was the previous state of the art. And you'll basically see that across these different discovery metrics, GNOME is able to discover substantially more materials than the previous state of the art method. A couple of final takeaways before we hand it off to our panel. We also did an analysis in the AI index on the number of AI-related regulations, and it's really the case, at least in the United States, that the number of AI-related regulations that are coming from regulatory bodies like the EPA or perhaps the Executive Office of the President are going through the roof. We counted one such regulation in 2016. In 2023, there were close to 25. And it's important to note as well that these regulations are coming from an increasingly diverse group of regulating bodies. This chart is looking at how many AI-related regulations were passed by various AI-related regulatory agencies, and you'll notice that there is a lot of blue on this heat map, which is suggestive of the fact that these regulations aren't just coming from one or two agencies, they're really spread out across the board, which speaks to the fact that a lot of different regulatory bodies in the United States are thinking very critically about how to use this tool and how to potentially integrate it and work with it. We also tracked in the index the degree to which these regulations were expansive or restrictive. By expansive, we mean a regulation that maybe builds up AI capacity. So imagine a government saying, we are going to give some money to build a network of supercomputers. Whereas a restrictive regulation is perhaps more setting rules about how this technology should be used. For instance, if you want to use a facial recognition algorithm, you need to disclose an impact assessment. You'll notice that regulations in the United States are becoming substantially more restrictive, which suggests that policymakers are trying to perhaps clamp down on how this technology is used. Final takeaway here, and this comes to us from the world of public opinion, people across the world are getting substantially more nervous about AI. Ipsos has done a really interesting survey in the last few years where it asked people across the globe whether they agreed with a bunch of AI-related statements. Now, what you're seeing in this chart is you're looking at the percentage point change in opinions from people that took the survey in 2022, before ChatGPT, and those that took the survey in 2023 after ChatGPT. And one of the questions that people were asked in both years is to what degree do you agree with the statement that products and services using AI make you nervous? And that's the box that's highlighted in the red there. And you'll notice that basically for every single country survey, there is substantially greater degrees of nervousness now than there were a year ago. So this is suggestive to us that people have woken up to the fact that this technology is here, and they're responding in a lot of ways with nervousness. So that wraps up our little kind of overview of the takeaways, and I think now we're very ready for what's going to be an excellent panel discussion. I'm going to introduce next Rahini Kasoglu, who's a policy fellow at HI, but was also the former deputy assistant to the president, domestic policy advisor to the vice president, and she's going to kick us off for the panel discussion. Sure.
So I'm so looking forward to this panel, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. So I'll get right into it. First, I want to introduce my esteemed colleagues over here, Russell Wald, Deputy Director at Stanford High, Vanessa Parley, Deputy of Research at High, and Eric Vinyolfsson, who's the Jerry Yang and Akiko Yamazaki Professor and Senior Fellow at Stanford and Director of the Digital Economy Lab. So just knowing that we have such limited time and I want to get to audience Q&A, everyone here has been working so hard on this index and some of the insights, but they also have been talking and thinking and working on so many different other pieces of work in the artificial intelligence space. I will just kick it off, right, and let's get into it. Russell, we've talked a lot at Stanford and we've been working with industry on so many different things, but there is a dynamic that is happening between industry and academia. And so many people here are really interested in better understanding and delving into, how should we be thinking about the dynamic and in the years ahead, some of the outcomes of AI as a result. So maybe talk a little bit to us about that.
Sure. And before I begin, I would just want to echo and thanks to the Hoover Institution for this partnership. It's been great to collaborate and work together on this. What I'll say is there was an important slide that Nestor just presented, and that was one that looked at the difference between 2017 and $930 to train the transformer model, and fast forward just 5 years, and it was almost $200 million to train Gemini Ultra. And that shift and that hockey stick up it has huge implications. One, you're starting and see these scaling laws that are showing the more compute and more data you throw at these systems, a higher quality output that you're getting out of this. This is great, and this is an incredible thing that we're seeing, but at the same time, what does it mean for who has a seat at the table? What does it mean for who's developing this technology? And one part of that is who are the stakeholders? And right now what we see as the primary stakeholders in this is industry. Industry has a runaway is run away with this, and that's great, and that should be wonderful for industry. But what does academia give you, which was the beginnings of artificial intelligence and the baseline foundations for all of this? Academia gives you the scientific discovery, curiosity-driven science, and that leads you to things like artificial intelligence, but also leads you to things like global positioning system, the internet. All of these things are later commercialized, and if we don't have that diversity in this case, we have two questions here. The first one is, will we get those same type of discoveries from a profit-driven area, which I would argue probably not. If you, just to quickly build on that, if it's GPS, I would have never invested in GPS if I had an opportunity, because if you invested it at a young age, you wouldn't see a rate of return on it until you were in your sunset years. So that's not the kind of things you're going to get. And then the second part of that is who's helping define the rules of the road. Is it going to be everything going to be shaped by this limited group of maybe 5 companies developing this, or is it going to be a broader pie of where all of society can have an equal say-so in that? And that's one of the concerns. And we now actually have the data that highlights that via the index.
Yeah, if you look in the index, there's an increasing disparity, certainly, in how many models are being produced by industry versus academia, and that's something you can track over the last several years. One of the just in terms of one of the other questions that comes up a lot in DC, and I know people are just trying to wrap their heads around how to think about this as well, is this issue of transparency. And so, so we know that in some of these models, an issue that often comes up is how do we evaluate this? How do we look at this? There was some mention earlier about benchmarks, but I think, Vanessa, it would be helpful for you as the director of research to help the people in the audience understand how should we be thinking about how to evaluate these models? What can we, as we look at the early years of the index versus where we are now, what are some things you can help people understand in terms of the best ways to ask questions around these?
So these benchmarks have evolved over time. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with the benchmarks, these are generally set by researchers or people in industry working closely with the technology to help evaluate how the system is doing. And they're essentially like goalposts. So once a benchmark is set, a lot of researchers start to try to meet and beat that benchmark. There's how to classify images, there's reasoning, there's math, and there's more and more around kind of responsibility, checking bias, checking truthfulness, which Nestor talked about. But I think it's very critical right now for us to think about what are these benchmarks that we're setting? How do we want this technology to evolve so that it benefits all of us? And how are we going to kind of set a standard way so that businesses and consumers can know what they're getting when they're trying to decide which different models they want to use, and be comfortable that those models aren't going to increase disparity, especially for folks like in the social sector who deal with data that can be quite sensitive, or healthcare. Like, how do we know if we're going to use these models that they're safe for everybody?
So since you led us into this on the consumers and businesses, Eric, just to turn over to you for a second. So one of the things for the last several years people have been talking about is what's the future of work? They're always looking to economists to help us understand the future of work, and obviously artificial intelligence has certainly shaped that. For all the, as we try and build towards a world that can look at both sides of consumer and business, what are your thoughts in the evolution of this conversation around future of work?
Yeah. Well, as Vanessa was saying, that benchmarks, the technical capabilities are advancing very rapidly, and now we're beginning to see it have a big effect on the rest of the economy, on wages and employment, on productivity, on industrial concentration. Well, it's good to be here in Washington. We just came from the White House, where the Council of Economic Advisors and all of the folks over there are very interested in these questions. There's a terrific chapter in the latest economic report of the president that I thought was very thorough, that discusses some of the economic implications. And of course, Nestor brought up some of the effects on productivity and also different groups. I'd say there's three big questions. I think there's not less of a prediction and more of a choice around productivity, inequality, and industrial concentration. The next 10 years, I think we could see a significant uptick in productivity. The technical capabilities are there, but technology by itself doesn't lead to greater economic output. You need to translate that into business transformation. You need to change business processes. You need to reskill the workforce. You need to have enough of a flexible economy that people can move and reorganize their production. And when we talked at the White House today about the need for making that easier. On inequality, much of the past couple of decades has seen a growing gap between high wage and low wage workers, but it was very encouraging that in many of the studies, including some that my team has done in the Digital Economy Lab, we found that generative AI and large language models tended to actually close some of those gaps. Less skilled workers often benefited disproportionately. So for instance, in a call center application, the least experienced workers and least skilled workers had about a 35% improvement in productivity, while the average worker only had about a 14%. So it was something that was really capturing some of the tacit knowledge and expertise of the best folks and making it accessible to other folks. And then on industrial concentration, Russell talked a little bit about how large these models are getting. And by the way, we ain't seeing nothing yet. Those several $100 million models are going to be followed by billion, multi-billion, tens of billions dollar models that are being scheduled now. There aren't that many companies or universities or even governments that can afford to make those kinds of investments. So that is a force that tends towards more concentration. At the same time, we're seeing open models that often are very capable. Llama 3 was just announced a few days ago, just in time for this talk here. And it is an open model that on many of the benchmarks performs as well as the leading proprietary models like GPT-4 and is widely accessible, and that can be a counterbalance to some of the concentration. But in each of these, I think there's some choices, some policy choices and some choices that executives have that can lead us towards a world of higher productivity, less inequality, and less concentration, or in the other direction if we make the wrong choices.
So it's an important point you touch upon, several, but particularly that piece about concentration. Mm-hmm. Even as we look geopolitically, there was a lot of the index that devoted some conversation that people have around what is happening around the globe, what is particularly happening in this dynamic, also with China even. So we saw increases in China with the number of patents, the sheer number of patents that they have been filing, in addition to their investments in robotics. And you can compare that to the United States, where you see much more dramatic effects in the United States around foundational models.
Right.
Russell, what are your thoughts on this sort of ever-growing dynamic? And also, I'd love to get your thoughts on the personnel involved in all of these, to train up these different researchers, train up workers in the industry, and how, you think this sort of United States and China piece we need to be thinking about in the years ahead.
So there is this back and forth that we keep hearing about who's winning in this space, and it's very difficult to measure in the first place. And even if you look at the index, when you're looking at the index, there's a lot of interesting data points in here that can color what you think. I'm just going to give my more personal view of what I see, because you see, for example, patents are up, but you also see on China's side, last year's index, you saw journal articles were up. China had exceeded on academic journals. So, but then on the US side, you see just a takeaway on the levels of these frontier foundation models that are out there. The US is by far ahead in this space. So it's really hard to say who's ahead and who's not. If I were to give my personal view from analyzing this and thinking about it, it looks like the US is pretty squarely ahead in this space to some extent. And I say that just because if you look at the model releases, but also the investment that's happening in China compared, private investment compared in China versus the US. But I would also say that there's another part of the report that notes how many of these are open. And there's back and forth on what we mean by open, and I'm not going to get too deep in the nuances here, but over 60%, I believe 65% or 67% of a lot of these foundation models that were released are open. And in that sense, the question shouldn't be who's winning. The issue is who's maintaining a lead or who is catching up or things like that, because it's never going to be, in my view, one or over the other at times, because with an open community, you're going to be able to have at least a pathway for it. I do think the question is more who has infrastructure for this, and I think you talked a little bit about this on the labor side. It's not just, from this week of conversations we've had, and Vanessa and I just had an interesting one yesterday, right down to the electrical grid, to be able to train these, the amount of energy that gets put into this. So what I will say is, I think if you're looking at this, who has a seat at the table in terms of the other countries beyond the US and China, it certainly is going to be difficult for the global majority to be able to help. It's not just having access to chips, it's also being able to have access to the infrastructure and the electrical infrastructure and the grid that's going to be able to do that. And that's something I just got from this week of engagement, and I hope to understand more about that and study that a little bit more.
That's great, Vanessa. Any thoughts on that?
It just around like who's winning, that we need to think also about the talent. Like right now, there's only a handful of folks who actually know how to do the engineering of training these extremely large models. There will be more, but still, we need to think about where we're training those people. And
Yeah.
Can I build on that real quick? Because you did ask that earlier question. I don't think I talked about this. Why academia does need a seat and needs to be a player in this is because who's going to train the next generation? Who's going to train the regulators to be able to regulate the technology? Who's going to train the people to be able to do this? We need to have academia in this to be able to train the next generation to understand how all of this works. There are policy proposals that sit out there. I see someone wearing a National AI Research Resource t-shirt, which I'm a big fan of. And there is the Create AI Act, which is a bipartisan act in Congress that will hopefully pass, and that will provide compute and data resources for academic institutions, and that will allow us to train the next generation.
Eric,
and
yeah.
I'll just add another, underscoring what both
You
Russell
have
and Vanessa
students,
said.
like, oh yeah.
Well, the students
We've got a great class this quarter.
Yeah, no, we have it's overfull class, but probably America's biggest asset is it's a magnet for talent from all over the world. And last year when I went to a White House summit, I asked my team, there's so many different things we can talk to them about. What should I emphasize? And they came back to me and said, immigration. Most of them were immigrants.
Yeah.
And the process for them to stay in America, where they really want to contribute, and we've invested a lot in training them. They're the best and the brightest from their countries, and often are forced to go back, or they have to wait literally decades sometimes to get the visas and citizenship. It's boggling to me why we do this, and I'm glad that right now we are such a magnet for the very smartest people from all over the world to come, but it won't always be that way if we force them to go back and squander our lead here. So this is something that I think that is a policy choice that we should do better on. The other things I'll mention briefly are energy. That's going to become a greater need as these data centers get larger and larger. And of course, everyone knows that the chips are a key bottleneck right now.
It would be rare to meet a faculty member that did not raise immigration, so thank you for making sure.
Wanted to make sure that was, loud
On behalf
and clear.
of your fellow faculty members, yes.
We sit in the computer science building at Stanford University. And so this is anecdotal, but we have so many brilliant students that want to stay and contribute, PhDs in AI, and where do they go? Not to their home country where they don't want to go, but they certainly don't stay in the US. A lot of them go to Canada or to other areas, and what a loss for us.
Thank you for that. It wouldn't be Washington, D.C. without mentioning that we are in an election year. One of the things that I know is on the top of people's mind is about the use of artificial intelligence in our elections. And the index doesn't go into, super technical detail, but it does touch upon where we are at in terms of understanding deepfakes and the other things that are out there. Can you talk a little bit, any of you, whoever wants to take it first, but just in terms of some of the things you think it would be helpful for people to be mindful of as they go about this election year, and hope and pray it doesn't get too contentious?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure everyone has an opinion on this and thoughts. Nestor showed those amazing charts of the improvement, and you can right now make a very plausible, not just still picture, but a video of people talking in their own voice from just a few seconds of recording. You can take that and replicate somebody. So not just when you hear Joe Biden or Donald Trump giving a talk, it may not really be them, but even like your daughter calling from the airport, and even if you do a video call, you can't be sure whether it's really that person, and the content can be pretty plausible as well. So this is a real challenge, and it's crossing a threshold where it can be abused by people for phishing attacks, also for political misinformation attacks. It's not easy to solve. There's no real easy way to tag something as a deep fake. I mean, maybe some of the companies that make the technology will voluntarily tag them, but there's going to be bad actors that work around that or have their own models. So that's a real problem. I think there may be a partial solution or mitigation. If you can't really tag the fakes, but you can tag the real ones. So, Joe Biden could have a public key authentication. Donald Trump, New York Times, the Hoover Institution could have a key that when they send out content, they say, this is legitimately from us. This is the real Hoover Institution. And that might sort of give people at least a chance to know, okay, this one has been certified, that one hasn't. We already have something like that for commerce. When you buy something from Amazon or other sites, you use SSL, which uses public key cryptography, so you know that your credit card is going to the real site. I'd like to see that platform spread more widely to authenticate other kinds of content. It's not a complete solution. It doesn't say that what the content is true or not. It just says that it's from this entity that it claims to be from.
Yeah, that's great. Stanford actually just held a policy conference on governance with developing countries, and it was a big note at the conference about how developed nations or developing countries were seeing that they were being almost like a hotbed of deep fakes in terms of that. And so you could imagine that some of the developed nations were looking at this and, trying to figure out how to mitigate some of these issues as we move forward. I am being told that it's a good time to go to audience questions. And so if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to. Okay, that happened a lot all at once, which is great. Everyone's very engaged. All right, we should let him go, given the T-shirt.
You got the T-shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you wore the right T-shirt, so you should get the first.
Yes.
Anyone wearing one of those T-shirts gets their question first.
It's a NAIR. It's supporting the NAIR, which is a very important research on AI, research resource on AI right now.
Last night, Kevin Walsh was speaking here. You probably know him.
Yep.
And he was making a case for, is AI for good ever going to get to K-12 education? He felt that part of the problem of democratizing AI remains that maybe the top 20 or 30% are seeing a booming economy, but lower down, not so much. And unless, if I understood his argument correctly, unless we get AI into K-12 education, we may miss all the strengths of good AI. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. Well, it is such a huge opportunity to have AI used more widely for education. Of course, in my class, we use AI, and I haven't tried to ban people. I've tried to lean in and encourage them to use it. There's an even bigger opportunity in K through 12. I've been doing some work with Tom Mitchell. We have a report coming out for the National Academies, hopefully within a few weeks. It just has to get through some reviewers. But he showed me some amazing results using large language models to provide much more personalized education. As you all may know, there's been research that shows when kids get personalized education, they can get up to about 2 standard deviations faster progress on learning content than when they're all taught in a big group. Of course, it's too expensive to give everybody an individual human tutor. Some people can afford them, but LLMs have the potential to do that, and it may be even better than humans in terms of being, infinitely patient, very customized. We played around with it, and it was giving great hints. It wouldn't give you the answer; it would kind of guide you with a new question that sort of helped you discover for yourself, which is a better way of learning. And then we even turned on some of we asked it to be more humorous. We asked it to ask the questions in the style of a pirate or the style of Taylor Swift, and it was hilarious. It was like a really great teacher that you may have had in 7th grade or whatever that hammed it up, explained the content, but also did it in an entertaining and engaging way. I'm hopeful that will happen faster. I think, to be frank, education has been on the lagging edge. My industry has been one of the slower ones to take advantage of these technologies, and I hope that changes in the next few years.
And I'll mention too, so I'm actually headed over to the Department of Education after this. Today is AI Literacy Day. So the field is thinking about this. There is a project out of Stanford where this is for, we released the most popular computer science course online, and they are using AI technologies to help train novice teachers so more people can then train students. It's been running for 3 years about now, and they've trained like 1,000 teachers, 30,000 students. So there is active work being done. HAI has a resource called CRAFT, led by Professor Victor Lee, where they are taking kind of the leading edge research and translating it into modules for K-12 educators to use in their courses. So there's like activities and various things, and it's based out of the Graduate School of Education and HAI. So it's based in folks who know how to teach.
That's great. We should all feel better that Vanessa's going to the Department of Education after this.
Thanks, everyone. On the compute costs increasing and scaling, where we're seeing monopoly dynamics, where there's only a few large companies that can afford it, do you see that? What do you think about that going forward? Because with gains in compute efficiency, like NVIDIA's new H100 models, which are more efficient, and also in Silicon Valley, more startups around hardware and compute, it seems like costs could be going down and we could be having more democratization of compute. Any thoughts about that going forward?
But what we're not seeing is a difference in terms of the output on the scaling laws. So if you saw diminishing returns, I think it might be on the output and what was coming. Maybe, but if you are Google, you can afford $200 million to do this, and maybe you can afford $300 million, and you'll want to expand the parameters more. So it's an issue of cost maybe, and it might get better at some point for the rest, but it will not, I don't think it will ever have a point where there'll be parity, but because you see on these scaling laws, the return is too good. If you saw diminishing returns, that might make it different, but I just don't see it stopping at this point.
Russell, do you want to maybe tell the audience about what the Create AI Act would do?
Sure. So this is something that HAI has championed since 2019, and it comes from our co-directors, Fei Li and John Etchmendy, and they recognized in 2019 a lot of these publications that were coming out that were at the frontier level were coming from industry, and it was perplexing to them, and they started to look a little bit deeper and seeing that they had the resources and were putting those resources behind this. So what they started advocating for is the need that there should be some kind of government intervention here as a necessity to keep academia in the game, and to do that, you need to have government provide some form of compute infrastructure for public sector AI development, as well as unlocking a lot of government data sets. The government sits on a lot of powerful data that could make a huge difference, whether that's weather data, agricultural data, and so by providing that for academia, you can still help train and have a public sector good style of research and development. So ultimately what it leads to is the National AI Research Resource, which is a pilot in the Biden administration right now. And there's strong bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress for the Create AI Act, which would codify this and fully fund a national AI research resource. So will it make a big difference for universities like Stanford and MIT? Marginally. Will it make a huge probably difference for other students at other not as high tier or elite schools that want to learn how to do this and participate in this system? Yes, I think it'll have a significant difference. So if you want to spread this across the country so that you don't have to just be at an elite school to kind of do it, you can have more access to broadly throughout the country, and that's going to be really important to make sure that we have more stakeholders throughout the country.
And balance incentives. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, to the specific question about this bottleneck and whether some of the technological innovations will alleviate it, well, there's really two forces in opposite directions. The technology is definitely improving, more players are coming in, the CHIPS Act, so all of that is good news. And over the past decade or so, we've had massively growing use in data centers, improved chip technology, and that's roughly canceled out so that the overall electricity use and so forth has been relatively level. Going forward, I don't think that's going to be the case. All the bets are that the big companies are making and the projections are, and we don't know for sure what's going to happen, but that these scaling laws will not hit diminishing returns and that they are going to make much more aggressive investments, outstripping the improvements in the capabilities and the additional capacity. So we're going to continue to have that be a major bottleneck, and a bigger and bigger share of the economy is going to go into chips and electricity and powering these models, even as the core technology gets better. And that's going to make it even more important, as Russell was saying, for us to make investments so that it becomes more widely shared as a resource.
Yeah, and that the incentives, we get them right.
Questions?
Oh, gosh. Okay. I think his hand up was in the back, actually, for the third.
Thank you. Sort of related a little to the last question is, to what extent do you think that domain-specific AI are going to be give a much greater benefit than the foundational models? I mean, excuse me. I mean, the diminishing returns and so on, and the cost of training data sets for foundational models is getting absurd. We've even heard of a potential $7 trillion investment being requested.
Yeah, that's not a real number.
And at that point, we fall over. So I'm just interested in what your opinions about whether domain-specific AI is likely to have greater benefits. Also, slightly different question. What if the transformative generative model is superseded by something that's better?
I say all of the above. So I think there will be more and more domain-specific ones, but also core. It's not an either-or. Often you can take these large foundation models, that's the idea, and then you can customize them. And the context windows are getting huge, like a million tokens. So you can have it take the base one and then customize it a great deal. And a lot of the value, as you're suggesting, will be in these more focused ones. And often you can have a much cheaper, simpler base model if it's a focused application. Probably there's going to be an ecosystem of models focused on different applications with different types of specific data. People who have that kind of unique data, that may become increasingly valuable for those particular applications. And the second question was
Whether the theory of transformative.
Oh yeah, transform. Yeah. Well, so they're already working on a lot of extensions. So there's been such a rush of talent into the field, developing new ideas, and so already we're seeing agentic AI, we're seeing text to action, we're seeing multimodal, we're seeing new paradigms other than the transformer that are emerging. So I have little doubt that there's a whole set of different. We already see them coming in. Jan LeCun talks about world models, so does Fei Li, that use different approaches. All these are happening in parallel. So we're seeing advances. I mean, one way to think about the scaling laws, the initial research talks about more compute, more data, but also improvements in algorithms. And the improvements in the algorithms have been at least as important as the other two. And I don't see that. I see that accelerating just given the influx of investment and talent.
Oh gosh, this is a great panel.
For the microphone.
Thank you. I just have a quick question for you. Sorry, what is your name?
Eric.
Eric, yeah. You mentioned that it's very important to keep all the students that come from all over the world, especially the bright ones, okay? And that unfortunately they had to go back home and wait almost 10 years to come here and become someone here. How about all the PhDs that are already here, very bright young people, already with experience from AI governance, risk management, policy issues? How about all those? Why they are ignored? I mean, they're always trying to look outside, but they are already here. I know a lot of talent because I go to all those meetings, so I want to know why.
It's a great question. They're not ignored. I mean, if you look at wages for people with more education, they've grown relative to people with less education. So there's the economic supply and demand are not keeping up. So you're seeing a bigger gap. What's more, paradoxically, when you bring more talent from the rest of the world, it's not a zero-sum game. It creates more value all around. Why is Silicon Valley, why are American engineers in Silicon Valley paid so much more than they are in Iowa, let alone in India or South Africa? Why? Because there's other smart people there for them to work with. So when smart people get together, they make each other more valuable. I think there's too often this mindset that bringing people in from the rest of the world diminishes the value of what we can create here. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm made more valuable when I have more smart people that I can work with. That's one of the reasons I came to Stanford. And they're made more valuable to have other people together. And so it's good for them, and it's also good for the world for us to be able to create new innovations that probably would never happen if you didn't bring these people together or give them a chance to work side by side with each other. So far from ignoring those PhDs that are here, I want to help them by giving them more smart people to work with.
And I want to just chime in. I know your question was for him, and I know we have a lot of questions, but it's really important to understand, too, that it is a supply and demand issue. And in fact, in academia, we do see a brain drain. There is this noted in the AI index, it's significant, the brain drain that's happening in this particular space, and it's worrisome. And in fact, just a little non-scientific, but an analysis we did of ourselves internally at Stanford of our core AI tenured faculty. Since 2013, we have lost a third of them. One of them only went into retirement and the rest went into industry because the demand is so high. And it's not just that, as we were talking about the resource aspect, it's not just salaries. If you can't do that frontier exciting work, you don't want to stay and not being able to have some skin in the game and learn how to do this type of work. So it's just the demand is just beyond what we currently have.
Yeah, so I think there's two threads in terms of, one is the immigration context that people have raised, but then also the brain drain even to industry in terms of the discrepancy on wages and how much more resources they have in terms of exciting work that from these models. Okay, Daniel, I'm just going to let you.
What a really interesting panel. My name is Monica Anderson, and I'm the director of the technology team at Pew Research Center. So we do a ton of public opinion research on AI. And my question is really focused on the tech industry as a whole. We know that big tech has a diversity issue, self-described, particularly in getting Blacks and Hispanics into those companies. And I'm wondering if there's anyone that's tracking racial and ethnic diversity within kind of AI industry, research, different levels. And then if you could talk a little bit about kind of the implications when you don't have a more diverse workforce, particularly from Black and Brown communities.
So I will say that we do have a diversity chapter in the index.
There's a whole chapter on it, exactly.
But I will also say that if any of you out there or in this room have sources of data that do track this in a robust way, we would love to talk, because I think that there's more that we can do in that chapter. And I mean, the risk of not having a diverse set of voices at the table in the development of this technology is that it does not benefit all of us. Like, we are a diverse country, we are a diverse world, and we can't leave it up to just a handful of people who think similarly to make decisions for us that will impact all of our lives. Like Joy Balamwini had her big paper on where the facial recognition wasn't picking up Black faces. If there were more Black folks working on that research, maybe that would not have happened.
Yeah, and we just actually just a few weeks ago released a paper out of Stanford with Professor Sanmi Koyeho, who's also head of Black in AI, and Professor Michelle Elam, really for the Congressional Black Caucus, highlighting some issues that would be helpful for lawmakers to think about the application of AI, particularly around Black Americans. And it was really fascinating in terms of going through the work because it spreads across a lot of sectors, whether it's everything from healthcare to financial services and facial recognition. So that's another area you may want to take a look at.
Hi, my name is Matthew, and I'm with a think tank called Center for Information Policy Leadership. Just a fantastic discussion. I wanted to come back to the point from the findings on the report about the lack of standardization and measuring, call it responsible AI. Three-part question. Number one, do we know how to measure outcomes versus process? I see a lot of metrics for how do you design AI governance responsibly, but do we have good metrics for the actual outcomes? Number two, what would be the best way to standardize? Would it be through regulation or industry bodies agreeing on a standard? And the third part, do these need to be done by external audit, or can a body credibly audit itself? Thanks.
All right.
Yeah, the best way to do it. Just tell them the best way to do it.
So I have to remember all your three parts. But the first part around measuring outcomes, so I will say that I do think the benchmarks that some of these model developers evaluate their models on are based on outcomes. So I know I keep using the ImageNet example just because it's easy at this point, but there's a bunch of images, and then developers will test different algorithms on those images and see how many they got right. So it's like a 90% or whatever. So I would say that most of the technical benchmarks are outcome based. What was your second part? I'm sorry.
How do we standardize? Do we need laws to tell us?
Yeah, so that's also, I think, will be a balance because of kind of my point earlier. We need many different voices in that conversation so that those standardizations don't have adverse outcomes. But I do think it will be beneficial for there to be some guidance on what do we need to make sure that these models are safe. And I don't think we can just leave it up to industry or just leave it up to government or just leave it up to the researchers. We need a group mindset.
You have seen the government try and be thoughtful about letting a process happen where there can be people from many different stakeholder arenas that are giving input. So I think that's a good point, Vanessa.
You have time for one more? One more?
Yeah, Daniel, she's just been like dying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question, Lucine, I'm with National Fair Housing Alliance as an AI policy researcher. It's an extension of what Matthew asked. There's currently a RFI from the OMB on the responsible procurement of AI in the federal government. I'm just interested, from your expertise, we have you here, what are the top three things in terms of whether it's standard benchmarks or recommendations that you would want to be seen in these guidelines for responsible procurement of AI in federal government? Obviously, the private sector is out of scope here, but just curious from your perspective in terms of standardizing benchmarks for fairness, bias, anything that you think should be a priority for them.
So Vanessa's probably the better one to answer this question, but I do want to say that's one really important thing that we keep hearing about regulations over and over inside the US. There's a lot of existing regulations that will apply to AI in the first place. We will definitely need new regulations, but one other important part that I think we don't give enough attention to is this backdoor way of regulations, in my view, and that is through acquisition and procurement. Through acquisition and procurement, you actually can use the federal government's purchasing power, which is very attractive to some of these companies, to say, here are the specific areas you need to meet these requirements, and then we will purchase this from you. That's going to be more of an incentivization and norms kind of establishing if we're able to get that right and do that. But I'll let you comment on your top 3 that you think should be in it.
So I think it depends. I'll give one. As a first step, I would say transparency. So right now, we don't even know for many, especially of the closed models, what data is it trained on? What is the architecture behind it? And without knowing those types of issues, we know that there are bias concerns based on data. And if we don't even know what it's trained on, how can we feel safe using the model? I think a key first step would be at least being able to see what goes into the training of the models.
Okay, one last question. Raise your hand really high if you want to be this last question. I see people stretching a little bit.
You pick right there.
You pick.
The closest
Put 2 together.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
Rapid fire.
That's nice of you.
2 at one time.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. Thank you so much. Karen Morangi with RELX. We're the parent company of LexisNexis and Elsevier, and we produce content and use it. To follow on, Vanessa, what you just said, we're talking a lot about the fact that there needs to be quality content continuously being created to ensure there's trustworthy AI as an output. And from where we sit, IP sits center to that, and the need to continue to have strong and protective policies, especially for copyright. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if others of you want to expand on that, but I think we're actually using messaging around town, trying to make that connection. If you want good trustworthy AI, you need the quality content, you need IP. And we know some AI developers have sort of said that, but I don't know if you've got more you can amplify about how the risk of quality AI disappearing, impacting trustworthy AI as an output.
Yes. Do you want to talk about IP?
Oh, yeah, he's going to let one more question go. And then
gosh. Okay.
All right, I love it that I get to follow that question because my question is also on IP. So Lucia Vitale, I'm at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I'm a global health scholar. So I think a lot about IP in terms of pharmaceutical companies. So something we see a lot in global health is sort of the role of pharmaceutical companies in designing a drug, a medicine, a therapeutic, and then patenting it. And in doing so, kind of affirming that they are the only ones that get access to that for X amount of years. I have an example, and then I'll get into the question. In 2023, there was kind of a race between scientists at my institution, UCSC, and Celera, which is an industry actor, to map the human genome. And so the narrative that kind of came out of this was that there is this public institution that was going to map the human genome and have it available for all researchers to access. And then there was sort of this industry actor, Celera, that was going to map the human genome, kind of lock it up with intellectual property rights, and then researchers would presumably not have access. This was kind of the narrative that came out of this. So my question, in thinking about this with AI, in thinking about, and Dr. Wald, you kind of have been charting.
I don't have a PhD, but thank you.
Okay. Mr. Wald, rather. In sort of thinking about all of these ways that public, private, industry, academia are kind of blending together, and in some ways sort of competing, where do you see the future of intellectual property rights, and specifically around access to these AI tools that are being developed? Thank you.
So do you want to take the first part?
Yeah. So I think that for the first question, I think there is a really strong connection between some of these, the transparency and perhaps guardrails and responsible AI. Like us me and others who I've talked to, we don't know which tools to use for which use cases, and how do we trust the tools that we're using. And as more and more issues start to pop up, I think us as citizens will more and more want some sort of guidance on what to look for, and it will be good for everybody, for everyone to have kind of a standard way of thinking about it. It's just like all all a loop and a chain. In the index, we do highlight, it's like an AI incident report, and you do see like fairness incidences of AI going up. I mean, it could be because everyone's just more aware of AI right now, but there have been more and more kind of people raising their hands saying, like, hey, this doesn't seem right.
It's really challenging across patent law by sector. So you raised a healthcare specific example, but that it will look different if you can imagine the music industry, right? So we can imagine that the courts also, it'll be a really interesting time period, and even as judges are trying to wrap their heads around it, everyone's staying engaged on this topic so that they can also advocate for here's a different way that the courts may want to think about this. And so whether it's filing amicus briefs or things like that, but I do think it will look different across different sectors. So that's why you see even the mentions of patents within the report is even broken down into some different sectors and things like that.
Yeah, I like your advocacy point too. I think we all need to advocate for the tools that we want and how we want to use them versus them just being like dropped onto us.
I'm just going to give a quick meta point, just because I know we're really over. On your part of the human genome, it's super interesting to me because then I use that as a great example of what kind of what do we want out of this? And there was a choice that the government was faced with. Is this going to be mapped out by private industry exclusively, or will we have a public aspect? And I think it was started in the Bush administration, actually part of the Reagan administration, I think then the Bush administration, and it's later in the Clinton administration that it's revealed the early mapping of the human genome, and it's both a private sector version and a public sector version. We certainly need public sector AI, and I think that's just the greater meta point I would like to leave a lot of people with. We need greater public investment in this so all of us can understand it and we can all be participants in this. If we don't, it's going to be left to 5 companies and we will be at their will.
Eric?
No, I'll just make an even meta point, which is that this is an example of how we need to rethink a lot of our institutions, our laws, because IP was designed for an era where AI systems could not invent or design new things. And so, for instance, copyright, patents, they're useful, but they're going to have to be updated in a significant way. We met with Senator Warner on an earlier visit, and I know that there's some thoughts of rewriting it. New York Times and OpenAI are in a tussle about that. But some of the folks that I'm working with, we're trying to go back, down to the basics of what incentives do we want to create for researchers, for people to be using it, for scientists, for artists, for musicians, to create content, but also for people to use it. You don't necessarily want to give all the rights to one group or the other. And the economics of that can be very interesting, of trying to come up with a set of institutions and platforms and incentives that create the greatest incentives for value creation. The ones that we have existing are not likely to be exactly the right ones we want to have going forward. So we're working on that foundation. And I think that one of the things that we're doing at Stanford and at High is to come up not just with innovations on the technology side, but also on our economics and our institutions.
Well, on that note, thank you all very much. And let's give a round of applause for our participants. I hope that whether this is for work or a cocktail party, that people feel a little bit more confident about using this information. There is a reception that we'll be having afterwards, so we look forward to talking to you.